Hi everybody, this is Dr. Jennifer Smith from New Mexico State University in Alamogordo, and I'm providing a brief overview of the history of the rough-footed mud turtle found in far west Texas in Presidio County. So there's a lot of common names for this species, and we'll stick with the scientific name here, which is Kenasternum hirtipes murray. And in Latin, hirtus means hairy or rough, and pes means foot. Thus, the species was given the name of hirtipes because of the characteristic patches of papillose skin on the inner hind legs of both males and females. Their tails are also covered with these little bumps, and is the easiest way to differentiate quickly in the field between its congenitor, K. flavescens, or the yellow mud turtle. Turn them over and look at their tails. If it's smooth, it's probably a yellow, and if it's bumpy, it's probably one of ours that is a lot less common. So other identifying features, if you get more into it, is the carapace is dark olive green, is sometimes more flat and other times more domed, and I've found that it's depending on the location of the population. But generally the carapace is at least slightly domed on the posterior end and slowly slopes towards the anterior end. The plastron is often lighter with brown in the areas of recent growth. Sometimes you can age the juveniles on these growth rings if they're not too old and worn. Travis LeDuc from UT Austin showed me how to do this in the field, so thank you, Travis. And lastly, there's two pairs of fleshy barbels on the chin of both male and female, and this is specific to K. hirtipes murray. In 1986, a paper was written by Dr. Jim Skuddy, who at the time was a professor at Sul State University in Alpine, Texas, and Denny Miller, who was head of the Chihuahuan Desert Research Institute, both of whom I was fortunate enough to study under. Denny showed me the ropes to carry on his and Dr. Skuddy's work, so thank you, Denny. We're working hard to preserve this species in Texas. This paper described the historic locations, which included the type locality, where it was first described by Glass and Hartwig in 1951, and named the subspecies murray after the respected professor. Fred Gilbach from Baylor University found only two populations in 1971 in Texas, one of which was also this type locality location. This is how the turtles got the nickname, said with a smile by local ranchers, as the Baptist turtles. The other location found by Gilbach was 16 miles south of this location. Based on Gilbach's report, the turtles were placed on the Texas Protected Non-Game Species List in 1977. That was published by Conant and Berry in 1978. During my work on searching for populations of turtles, I found that all of these historic locations, with the exception of the type locality, had either been drained by landowners due to their dislike of cattails or due to drought conditions. In addition, my research crew and I searched the entire drainage basin of Alameda Creek all the way south to the Rio Grande confluence, where we did not find turtles. They were known historically to be in the Rio Grande. However, the good news is that some new locations have been found that have evolved over the last 20 years or so. And this was the best I could determine based on Miller and Skuddy's publication, global images, and memories of those who have been around in the area. These relatively new locations are all fed by artesian springs, with 3 out of 4 being man-made ponds or tanks, and the other is located in a running creek, which probably most closely mimics their native habitat. 1 out of 3 of these populations is thriving, with juveniles showing up each year, and this complex is what my data reflect that I will discuss later. The rest of these populations have an issue or two. One problem is at the type locality, where there were very few turtles and no females, no juveniles. We caught the record-sized male turtle at this location with a carapace length of 195 millimeters, which makes sense because this location has been around the longest, so it's natural that the turtles are large. There were very few turtles at this location, and I never caught a female or a juvenile. Therefore, this population is not increasing and is probably not sustainable. A second population that is having issues because there are huge catfish in the pond. I haven't caught any juveniles at this location either. I believe the juveniles are either being eaten, predated on their way to the pond, or if they make it to the pond, they're being consumed by the catfish. There are both males and females in this pond, and they are all large-size adults of 125 millimeter carapace length and larger. The third population was found to have an infestation of a sessile-stalked rotifer in the genus Epistylus. We removed the 7 turtles from this pond, dried it out, rehabilitated the pond for a healthier water quality, and treated the turtles at the San Antonio Zoo. Hopefully, they will be returned sometime this year to their new and healthy home. It's important to note that there were no juveniles at this location either, probably due to the deteriorated health of the adults. I could talk all day about these turtles, but luckily for you, time is limited. I calculated the population to be at 165 individuals. This was at the currently known locations at the time. Since then, we have found a few more locations, but one of those has no juveniles due to predation of the catfish, and the other we know to be at 7 individuals because that pond we drained and treated for the infestation. When doing my field work, I would find desiccated carapaces around the ponds, and some weren't that near the ponds, maybe about 100 yards away. There were at least 12 incidences that I found them. They were found with canine-like bite marks, and some were cracked completely open, breaking the carapace. Others were just emptied out of all tissue with the carapace left intact. We published a study on this in 2018 with Platt Smith, Rainwater, and Boeing. When doing the telemetry study, I actually tracked a female that I believe left the pond overnight to nest and had been eaten. So when I found her the next morning, she was still wet. And I believe she was eaten by a raccoon because of how clean the inside of the carapace was, and there was no canine bite marks and no cracks. Turtles are vulnerable to predation when exposed by low water levels in ponds and when making overland movements between ponds and during nesting. This short segment is about movement, reproduction, eggs, and nesting. So the telemetry study that I did has revealed a much greater affinity to water than other Kinostertums. Fortunate enough to observe one of the females nesting, and this was published in 2018. I affixed VHS radio transmitters weighing about 3 grams to the posterior carapace of 13 sexually mature turtles. Turtle movements were monitored daily, and I marked them with the GPS. On June 20th, 2016, I was tracking a female that was submerged in the pond, and at 11 o'clock that morning, she moved into the outflow channel, which is very unusual. Afraid that I was going to get caught because she turned around and looked at me, so I didn't want her to abandon her nest, so I left, but continued to watch the monitor, the beeps with the telemetry to make sure she wasn't leaving. So it took about 2 hours, and she returned to the outflow channel. And that evening, I went back to the site and found eggshell fragments scattered, which is very disappointing, around the nest hole that had been excavated. And based on the tracks and the signs, I believe that it was a raccoon, again, that had excavated the nest and eaten the eggs sometime during that brief time I was hiding from her. She relocated in the outflow channel about 5 meters from the nest site, where she stayed buried for another 2 days before moving back into the pond. I got some news on the nest. Generally, the females lay clutches of 2 to 3 eggs, 1 to 2 clutches per season, depending on the maturity and size of the female. And Iverson published that in 91. I found 4 additional nests during a population study of K. hirtibes at another site. In July 2017, I found 4 turtle nests along the western shoreline of that pond that also had been recently excavated, and I'm still blaming raccoons for it. The distance was only about 4 meters from the pond. To my knowledge, this is the first to describe nesting behavior and nest sites of K. hirtibes in the wild or in captivity. In summary, our observations and previous studies of K. hirtibes in Alameda Creek drainage indicate that females deposit eggs during June and July in West Texas. Eggs most likely overwinter in the nest, with embryos undergoing diapause at the onset of cooler autumn temperatures, and neonates emerge the following summer during the annual monsoon, which is July to August. Based on our limited number of females, appear to construct nests on bare, moderately shaded substrates within a relatively short distance of the water. Proximity of the nest to water reduces the risk of predation to nesting females and neonates. My goal is to get a few of these turtles into a captive breeding program here at the El Paso Zoo so we can get many offspring and return them to the wild. We are working on this exciting project at the moment, pending funding and available space. This turtle was the subject of my dissertation, which began in 2011. I'd like to acknowledge our conservation partners that include the Texas Parks and Wildlife Conservation License Plate Grant, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas Department of Transportation, New Mexico State University, University of Texas at Austin, University of California at Los Angeles, Wildlife Conservation Society, and the San Antonio Zoo, and hopefully the El Paso Zoo for our future captive breeding program.